All right, guys, we have officially made it, and this is going to be our last set of notes for the semester and year. And I know you guys are probably just as happy about this being the last video as I am. And so we're going to finish off the year talking about chordates, which for the most part is going to be your vertebrate groups, as well as our organ systems. Now, if we had more time, we probably would have split these up and kind of done a separate lesson on human body systems, but we're just going to kind of group all of them together and talk about the vertebrates as a whole. And then tomorrow you're going to spend some time kind of identifying certain characteristics about each vertebrate group. And so we're going to start with just what is a chordate again. So remember that when we look at kingdom Animalia, over 95% of animals are invertebrates. And you've kind of gotten to see a wide variety from sponges to cnidarians to arthropods and echinoderms. And so at this point, you should be familiar with the different phyla that fit under the invertebrate groups. And so now we're going to talk about the rest of kingdom Animalia, which is going to be your chordates. And so obviously, in terms of total number of animals, this is going to be 5% or less, but there's still going to be a lot of chordates on the planet. And so what makes a chordate a chordate? So they fall under phylum Chordata, and in order to be considered a chordate, they have to have these 4 characteristics. And we actually took a look at these whenever we were doing our kingdom Animalia notes. But they have a notochord, which is a supporting type of rod that, like in the vertebrates, becomes the actual vertebra. The dorsal hollow nerve cord, which in your more advanced chordates is going to be a spinal cord. That main nerve line, dorsal refers to back. So this is going to be the nerve line that runs down the back of the animal. Pharyngeal slits or pouches. In some organisms, these become gills. Some of them, they'll disappear. Remember, they only have to have these at some point in development. And then a tail that's beyond the anus. And so obviously we don't have tails as adults, so once again, just at some point in development. And so within phylum Chordata, we have 3 different subphylum. We have the non-vertebrate chordates, which these are not invertebrates. They're chordates, but they're not true vertebrates because they don't have a true backbone or vertebral column. And so these are going to include tunicates and lancelets, and they fall under these subphyla Urochordata and Cephalochordata. And then the majority of your chordates are going to be vertebrates that have a true vertebral column, and these fall in subphylum Vertebrata. And this is where we fit in kingdom Animalia. And so just a quick look at your non-vertebrate chordates. Once again, we only have 2 examples. We have tunicates and lancelets. And at a glance, the tunicates definitely do not look like a vertebrate. You would probably very quickly put them in an invertebrate group. They're called sea squirts, and their larvae have these characteristics of your chordates. But as adults, they actually look a lot like your very simple animals like sponges or cnidarians. The adults are sessile. They have really thick walls, and they just kind of look like little tubes or like little sacs. But they do have these characteristics in their early developmental stages, and they actually maintain those gill slits as adults. I'm going to show you a picture here in just a moment. And then your lancelets, at a quick glance, these would kind of look like tiny fish. They're very, very small. They're kind of nice shaped. They are aquatic. And so they have all 4 of those characteristics. Essentially, a lancelet looks like that basic chordate picture, where it has the dorsal hollow nerve cord, the notochord, the pharyngeal slits, and the tail. But they do have some segmentation, like your more complex invertebrates. They also have that nerve cord. And so here's what your tunicates look like. This would be your adult tunicates. You can see they really kind of look a lot like your invertebrate groups, like coral or sea anemones. They definitely don't look like they would be in the same group as your vertebrates. And then your lancelet does look a little bit fish-like, but they're pretty tiny, and you can see that they kind of maintain those structures. Now, the majority of your chordates are going to be in that subphylum Vertebrata. And so what sets vertebrates apart? These are going to be your most complex animals. Well, of course, vertebrates are going to have vertebra. They have a very strong jointed endoskeleton. Most of them have 2 pairs of appendages. like arms and legs, or front legs and back legs. They do have closed circulation, and we'll take a look at what that is in this lesson today. They're highly cephalized, which means they have a strong collection of nervous tissue in the head, and so they're going to have a greater sense of response. They have jaws, and then they have efficient respiration and excretion, and we're going to take a look at both of those functions today. One of the things you'll see as you study the vertebrates a lot of times is kind of like this evolutionary progression. And as we move through the vertebrates from the simpler to the more complex, we see the introduction of traits such as jaws and limbs and lungs and amniotic eggs. And so here's just a couple of phylogenetic trees. You can kind of see that we have a wide range here. We've got jawless fish. We've got actually 3 different groups of fish here. We have amphibians and reptiles. We have mammals and birds. And then the same thing over here. This includes that other deuterostome group, the echinoderms. And there you see your lancelets and your tunicates. We have our jawless fish here. We get into our fish with jaws, and we have 3 main groups there. And then your amphibians, and then your reptiles, and then there's your mammals. Looks like birds may be missing from that group. All right, now within the vertebrates, we have 5 main groups: the fish, amphibians, reptiles, birds, and mammals. And then tomorrow what you're going to do is kind of try to learn to distinguish some of the specific characteristics of each group. You've got some of them listed here, and as we go through the major functions and the major systems, we'll kind of talk about some differences amongst these groups as well. And so when we're looking at animals, and this doesn't just apply to your vertebrates, but there's essentially 7 essential functions in order to survive. And so a lot of these go along with the characteristics of life, and that we need energy, and so we have different ways of feeding. Remember that all animals are heterotrophic. We need circulation to distribute materials. We need respiration for gas exchange, excretion to get rid of waste. Now, not all animals move, but your vertebrates pretty much are all motile. They're able to move around freely. And in order to move, you do need support. Remember that strong endoskeleton. There's going to be reproduction and response. And so as we go through these notes, technically, we could look at these 7 essential functions for all animals. And remember that your simplest animals, like sponges, they don't really even have like true specialized tissues and organ systems. And so you kind of got to take a look at those and how they accomplish different tasks. So we're not really going to focus on the invertebrates here. We are only going to focus on the vertebrates. But just to be clear, your invertebrates have to do these functions as well. They're just going to do them in more simplistic ways with more simplistic structures. What we're going to focus on in this lesson are the vertebrates, and all of your vertebrates are going to have complex organs and organ systems. And so this is how we're going to cover the organ systems as well. So the first function we're going to take a look at is digestion. And obviously among your animal kingdom, there's different types of feeders. There's the plant eaters, there's the plant and animal eaters, and then there's the animal eaters. And so that can affect certain aspects of their digestive system. But for the most part, when we're looking at animals, your vertebrates are going to be bulk feeders. They're going to eat large pieces of food. Now, they do have what's called extracellular digestion, and this is present in most of your animals. But what this means is it doesn't take place in the individual cells. It's actually taking place in a specific digestive tract or cavity. And in vertebrates, we have a digestive tract with 2 openings. There's a mouth on one end, there's an anus on the other. And essentially you have this food tube that runs all through the middle of the body, and the waste will be excreted at the other end. Okay, so you eat, it begins in your mouth, it travels down the esophagus into the stomach. From the stomach, it passes into the intestines. You've got the small first and then the large, and then it comes out the rectum and the anus with whatever's left over. Now, some other features you may see that deal with digestion, you can see crops or stomachs. Like we don't have a crop, birds have a crop, but stomachs are usually like a storage type of organ. They do have digestive function sometimes, like as ours do. You know, we have hydrochloric acid in our stomachs to help us break down. We have some enzymes that help us break down food. Some vertebrates have gizzards, which they don't really have teeth like birds. They don't have teeth. Instead, they use the gizzards to kind of grind and fragment. A lot of your animals in the vertebrate groups do have teeth to help them grind and fragment food. Intestines are something that not all of your vertebrates are going to have, but it kind of lengthens that digestive tract, and they typically contain enzymes that help us break down food and absorb water and nutrients. And then some of the adaptations that you'll see is there's definitely some differences in teeth depending on the diet. You know, an herbivore doesn't need sharp tearing teeth, and so an herbivore is going to have a bunch of flat molars, whereas your omnivores will have a combination of meat-eating and plant-eating teeth. The way the jaw moves and works can vary. The length of the digestive system. Plant material is much harder to digest, and so it's much longer in organisms that eat plants. And then in addition to those long intestines, you typically will find those symbiotic, those mutualistic bacteria and other microorganisms living in the gut to help digest and break down food. All right, our next function is circulation, and the circulatory system is all about transport, transport, and transport. And the circulatory system works very closely with many other systems because what it does is it transports various materials all throughout the body. We need to transport oxygen, we need to transport waste, we need to transport hormones, we need to transport nutrients. And so circulation is just kind of a super highway within the body. So your vertebrate circulatory systems are going to have three components. There's going to be a muscular pump or heart, and these do vary among the vertebrates. We'll take a look at that here in a minute. There's going to be the circulatory fluid, which is the blood, which contains a lot of water, various types of cells, and other dissolved components. And then we have the blood vessels that are going to carry all of that blood throughout the body. Now we have three main types of blood vessels. Arteries always carry blood away from the heart. We have veins, which always bring the blood back to the heart. And then they're going to meet up in what's called capillaries. So the arteries are carrying blood away. The arteries are going to branch down into arterioles. They'll turn into these little tiny vessels known as the capillaries. And then they'll return the blood through venules and then veins back to the heart. Now, all of your vertebrates have what's called a closed circulatory system, and what that means is the blood is completely contained within the vessels. If we were looking at all of the animal kingdom, we would see that some animals just rely on pure diffusion. They don't actually have a system, and some animals have what's called an open circulatory system, and so we don't have just blood collecting and pooling in our gut. Our blood, unless we have an injury, which is bad, our blood should stay within the vessels. And so you notice over here, once again, the arteries carry away. They branch down into arterioles. This is going to be our capillary beds where all of the diffusion takes place. Your capillaries are very, very thin. And so this is where all of the exchange happens between the blood and the organs. And then that deoxygenated blood is going to be returned via venules and veins back to the heart. And so throughout the entire process, what we see is the blood staying within the vessels. And in order to have a closed circulatory system, it does require energy that we produce from metabolism to help maintain blood pressure. Now some more on circulation. We're going to take a look at that muscular pump, the heart. Now in our heart, we have two atria and two ventricles, but in some animals there's only 3 chambers or there's only 2 chambers. And so the upper chamber or chambers are known as atria, or one is an atrium. But your atria are going to be your receiving chambers. And the receiving chambers are going to kind of collect the blood either from the lungs or from the body. And then your ventricles are the larger chambers on the bottom, and these are the ones that are going to serve as your pumps. The ventricles are much bigger and thicker. They have a very thick muscular wall. And so the atria are up here, and then these big ventricles are down here, and they're going to pump the blood into the arteries away from the body. And here in a minute, we're going to take a look at the 2, 3, or 4 chambered hearts. And depending on the number of chambers, that will determine whether it's a single loop or a double loop circulation. And so in fish and in vertebrates that have gills, we see this two-chambered heart. There's one atrium and one ventricle. And so the way that works is the blood is going to go to the gills, pick up oxygen to the body, deliver it, and back. And so that's what it means by a single loop. We'll take a look at a picture here in just a moment. Now, in a double loop circulation, there's either 3 or 4 chambers. And we're going to see this in just about all the other vertebrates, your amphibians, your reptiles, your birds, and your mammals. And the 2 circuits involve a circuit that goes to the lungs and then a circuit that goes to the body. So instead of going straight to pick up oxygen into the body, the blood actually comes back to the heart first. So here we have a single loop circulation type of system. So we have the muscular heart. You can see there's only 2 chambers there. It's going to pump to the gills, pick up oxygen, go to the body, deliver the oxygen, and then come back. Now in the 2 loops, the double loop, we see a loop that goes to the lungs and picks up oxygen, and then it comes back to the heart. And then in the systemic circuit, it takes that blood to the body and back. So we can see loop 1 and loop 2, the pulmonary and the systemic. Now in your amphibians and reptiles that have the 3-chambered heart, you can see that there's some mixing of oxygenated and deoxygenated blood here. You can see that purple. But in the crocodiles, birds, and mammals, you can see that they have the 4 chambers, and so there is no mixing. The blue is on one side, the red is on the other, and so that deoxygenated and oxygenated blood are not mixed together. And so here's a little bit more specific of a diagram, and it kind of shows you the differences from fish to amphibians, reptiles. You know, crocodiles are an exception, birds, and then mammals. All right, our next major function is respiration, and respiration is all about gas exchange. We have to bring in oxygen so that we can do cellular respiration, and then we exhale CO2 as a byproduct. And it really doesn't matter what kind of respiratory structure it is. Respiratory surfaces are always going to be bathed in fluids. There's going to be moist, they're going to have moisture, and they're always going to have a very large surface area. And anytime you have foldings or extensions, you're going to increase your surface area. So we're only going to really look at gills and lungs in our lesson today, but you can see that there's layers of gills, and then your lungs are going to branch down into these little tiny air sacs called alveoli, and that's how you're going to increase your surface area for gas exchange. And so because we have the oxygen going into our blood and then the carbon dioxide being removed from our blood, we have a very close relationship between respiration and circulation. Now, in vertebrates, there's normally one of 2 options for respiration. There's either gills or there's lungs. Now, gills are going to be found mostly in fish. You will find some gills that remain in amphibians. There's some amphibian groups that have external gills, but for the most part, your gills are going to be in your fish, and you'll find them, of course, in organisms that live in the water. And so the gills are going to pick up oxygen because of countercurrent exchange. The water is going to flow through the gills opposite the blood flow, and it allows the blood to pick up oxygen. And so gills are going to be found with those single loop circulatory systems. And then everything else is going to contain lungs. Most of your amphibians, your reptiles, birds, and mammals. And what we have is an infolding of these surfaces. And so we have like this air passageway. We breathe in air through the nose and mouth. It passes through the throat area, known as the pharynx, down through the trachea, which is what we commonly call our windpipe. And then the trachea will branch into bronchi and then smaller bronchioles. And then at the very end, we have these little tiny air sacs called alveoli. And this is where all of those capillary beds are. And this is what allows for the exchange of oxygen and carbon dioxide. We also have respiratory pigments as vertebrates. Some of your invertebrates have these as well. They're just not necessarily hemoglobin. But if you were to look at the blood of a vertebrate, it is normally red, and it's red because of hemoglobin. This is the respiratory pigment found in vertebrates, and in hemoglobin is iron. And what iron does is it binds to oxygen. And so kind of an interesting fact is that in your red blood cells, because their job is to carry oxygen, they actually squish out their nucleus and other organelles so that they can fill up with hemoglobin, which allows them to carry more oxygen throughout your body. All right, our next function is excretion. Now, excretion is a very broad term. We really could refer to this more specifically. We're going to focus on the urinary excretion. We're going to focus on the excretion of nitrogenous waste. But technically, if you look at something in terms of an excretory system, that's just about getting rid of waste in general. And if we were looking at an excretory system, we may look at things like skin, because we can lose waste through our skin via sweat. We could actually consider lungs part of our excretory because of the exhalation of CO2. But in this particular lesson, when we're talking about excretion, we're going to focus on the urinary system, which is all about getting rid of nitrogenous waste. So just through basic chemical reactions that occur in our body, we produce nitrogen compounds and things like ammonia as a byproduct. Now, the issue with ammonia is that ammonia is toxic to our cells. And so depending on what type of animal or vertebrate it is, they can secrete these nitrogenous waste in different ways. Now, they could secrete it as ammonia, and you'll see this primarily, this is how aquatic organisms get rid of ammonia, or they get rid of nitrogenous waste. If you've ever had a fish aquarium, one of the things you have to manage in your water is a balance of nitrogen. Because if you don't clean out your tank, then ammonia can build up and it can actually become toxic to your fish just because it's such a small area of water. But for your fish, primarily they get rid of it in the form of ammonia. Now, some less toxic ways are to convert that ammonia in either to urea or uric acid. And so we get rid of ours in the form of urea in our urine. It's less toxic, but it does require energy to convert ammonia into urea in the liver. It also, in order to get rid of it, we do have to release some water with it. Now, uric acid, if you ever think about like the type of like bird poop, or if you've ever seen reptile like excrement, what we commonly call poop is actually a lot of uric acid. This is how they excrete theirs, and it's more like a paste or crystal-like substance. They actually pull all of the water out of it and get rid of it as a paste. And this is how reptiles and birds primarily get rid of their nitrogenous waste. Now, your vertebrates are going to have a complex organ called the kidney. And I'm sure the kidneys may vary a little bit from organism to organism, but in general, the kidneys have these little filtration centers known as nephrons, and they're these little tiny tube systems within this area of the neuron. We'd have to look at a blown up picture to see a nephron and how it works. But it's a combination of filtration and reabsorption. So we have a filtering effect in the nephron, and then the tubes that are associated with that are going to reabsorb and keep the stuff that we need in our bodies. And then whatever we do need to get rid of will be passed through the ureters to a bladder. Now, birds don't typically have a bladder, but in most of your vertebrates, they're going to have a bladder that stores the urine until they're ready to release it. Now, something else I wanted to mention, I technically could have put it with digestion. I could also put it with reproduction. But one thing you may hear or see as you go through the vertebrates is a term called a cloaca. And so a cloaca is just kind of a multi-purpose opening. So like for fish and for birds and even like your amphibians and reptiles, some of your mammals, all your egg layers, a lot of your egg layers are going to have cloacas. But it's actually one opening for the digestive tract, the urinary tract, and the reproductive tracts. So essentially they all kind of come together, and so the cloaca is where they eliminate the solid waste from digestion, the liquid waste from the excretory system, as well as where they release eggs. And so we don't really have a cloaca. We have separate openings like a urethra and an anus. And then in females, there's the vagina. But in many of your vertebrates, you do have this common opening known as the cloaca. All right, the next major function is movement and support. And once again, we mentioned earlier that vertebrates have a jointed endoskeleton. We're not really going to talk about the skeletal system in particular, but of course your skeletal system are your bones, which are going to help support, and they also aid in movement. We have different types of muscles like skeletal muscle and cardiac muscle and smooth muscle. And when we're talking about the musculoskeletal system, we're primarily talking about those skeletal muscles that are voluntary. And so throughout your vertebrate groups, they are motile and they are going to have muscles and skeletons in order to help them do that. Now, obviously, there's a variety. You know, fish swim, bats fly, a lot of other animals walk, run. They have different types of locomotion. But all of the bones within them, even though there's a lot of diversity in those limbs, a tetrapod is a four-limbed animal. But if you look at the limbs of these tetrapods, we actually looked at this in evolution, they have the same pattern of their bones. Okay, there's one bone in the upper portion of the limb, like the humerus or the femur. There's two bones in the lower portion of the limb, like the radius and the ulna, or the tibia and the fibula. Then there's small bones like wrists and ankles, and then you have the digits, which are like your phalanges or your fingers and toes. Now, not all vertebrates are going to have this. The limbs can be modified or lost, like obviously snakes don't have limbs. But for the most part, you have the same kind of basic layout in the vertebrate limbs, regardless of their function. And so here you can see that basic bone pattern. Once again, this is an example of homologous structures. And so even though that whale flipper does something very differently, it's still built for locomotion, even though the type of movement would be different than, say, in the turtle. All right, reproduction. This is our next to last major function. Now, obviously, all organisms need to reproduce. Your vertebrates are going to reproduce sexually for the most part. There could be a few exceptions there. But when it comes to sexual reproduction, there could either be external or internal fertilization. And so we know that fertilization, hopefully, is when the egg and sperm come together. And so if it's external, this is where the eggs are released. And you typically find this like in aquatic organisms. But the females will just release the eggs into the water, and then the males will release the sperm around the same time. And it's not necessarily, in terms of like natural selection, this could be an example of random mating with some animals. So the females release the eggs, the males release the sperm, and then the fertilization actually takes place outside of the female's body. Typically, in external, you're going to have very large numbers of gametes. A lot of eggs and a lot of sperm because it will be a bit more random, and they do have to release them at the same time. That's what synchronous means. The females have to release the eggs and the males have to release the sperm at the same time. So many of your fish and amphibians are going to reproduce that way. I will tell you that some amphibians, you may see pictures of frogs that looks like they're mating, but what happens is the male will kind of get on top of the female, not to fertilize, but just to kind of stimulate her to release the eggs. So it kind of looks like they're doing internal fertilization when in fact they are not. Now, internal is where the sperm is actually deposited into the female reproductive tract. So this is going to involve what we would refer to as sex or intercourse. And this allows for reproduction in dry environments. But obviously much fewer gametes and much fewer zygotes are going to be produced. And then if we have protected embryos, like in shells or in the mom, we have even fewer produced. When it comes to the embryo, we have three different types of nourishment. We have oviparous, ovoviviparous, and viviparous. And so I want to kind of take a look at these prefixes. Ovi means egg. Ovi or ovo, like an ovary produces eggs. A lot of O words refer to female reproduction and eggs. So here we have ov and here we have ovo. Both of those are referring to eggs. So oviparous are going to be your egg layers, which most of your vertebrates are going to be oviparous. Most fish, amphibians, reptiles, and birds. The birds should be on this list as well. And then we even have a mammalian group known as the monotremes, the egg-laying mammals, like a duck-billed platypus. So this is where the baby's going to develop within the egg. It's going to get nourishment from the yolk, and then the mother lays the eggs where they will complete development and then hatch from the egg outside of the mother's body. Our next group is the least common of the three, and this has ovo as well as vivi. So here we see vivi and here we see vivi, and viva refers to life or live, okay? And so your ovoviviparous, they do have eggs. There's the ovo. The baby's getting nourishment from the yolk, but they actually remain in the mom and they hatch internally, and then it has live birth. And so that's where you get that vivi from, the live birth. Now this is the least common of the three. There's some fish, like some sharks, and there's some reptiles, like some snakes, that are ovoviviparous, but most of them are going to be in this category up here, okay? And then the last group are viviparous. Notice there's no egg prefix, and that's because the baby is developing inside of the mom and getting nourishment directly from the mother via the placenta. And so these are also going to have live births. So this is going to be most mammals. This is going to include your placental mammals, like is what we are. It also includes your pouched mammals, your marsupials, like a kangaroo. Now the eggs themselves can also vary. Aquatic eggs, if you've ever seen fish eggs or frog eggs, they're very gelatinous. They're kind of jelly-like. They're very soft. They don't have shells, and they have to be laid in the water or they're going to dehydrate. And then the most advanced form is the amniotic egg, and I'm sure you've all seen chicken eggs or other eggs or maybe reptile eggs. So sometimes they have that outer, like very calcium-rich hard shell. That's a calcareous shell like birds have. And then there's also leathery and flexible like reptiles have. And so the amniotic egg, what's unique about them is they have these specialized membranes. You can see there's a variety of membranes here, and all of these are meant to surround and protect and provide nutrition, allow for circulation and excretion and different functions. And so by having the amniotic eggs, it allows for all of these complex processes, and it allows for life on land. Now, you may be thinking, humans, you may have heard the term an amniotic sac. We don't actually have an amniotic egg, but we are considered amniotes. Instead, we have the placenta, the umbilical cord, and the amniotic sac, and that's just kind of a modified form of this. We do have the specialized membranes and the nutrition coming from the mother. All right, and then the very last function is going to be response. And when it comes to the nervous system, all of your vertebrates have a complex brain. But if you take a look at these pictures over here, you can see that different parts of the brain are definitely more developed as we get up into the mammalian all the way up into the human groups. But all of your vertebrates are going to have that spinal cord that develops from the dorsal hollow nerve cord, and they're all going to have complex brains that have these specialized parts. So the cerebrum is this large yellow part, okay? And the cerebrum is kind of like your main thinking center, information processing, memory, speech, learning, even your personality is wrapped up in that cerebrum. And so the larger the cerebrum, the more processing skills you're going to have. And so obviously a human, I would like to believe, is a bit smarter than a goose or an alligator, because you can see that cerebrum is much more developed. The cerebellum is this little ball at the back of the brain. It's this brown structure here, and you can see that in just about all the pictures. It plays a major role in coordination and balance. Your brain stem, which is the purple here, it does a lot of life-sustaining functions like breathing and heart rate and just basic homeostasis. And then you have optic and olfactory. Your optic is for vision, and your olfactory is for smell. And so just in general, as we go from the fish, amphibians, reptiles, birds, and mammals, we see increasing cephalization and increasing learning and response. And that is going to wrap up our final lesson for dual credit biology for non-majors. We'll be taking a look soon at getting ready for the final. I hope you guys are doing well. Hopefully I can get around to see you soon. And that is all for our notes for the year. Y'all have a great one.